Okay, I'm going to talk you through this series of slides that you find on the wiki to provide additional explanation of some of the ideas that you can also find in the PDF that's towards the bottom of the page. So you'll see here a series of cartoons which reflect different issues in writing, and we'll come back to these as we work through the text, but hopefully that gives you a sort of insight into some of the issues that we're going to talk about. So before you get going, you might like to think about the sort of contexts that you write in, and also the tools that increasingly we use for writing, and also not just yourself but also your learners. And certainly there's been a significant shift in the role of writing in all sorts of parts of life in the last few years, and writing has become much more predominant again. So if you'd like to spend a few minutes sort of thinking, you know, how your writing life has changed, and maybe thinking about the writing that your students do, and whether it is still only for many people part of an academic process, or it's become kind of more significant than that. So what's some of the background to writing and computers? So we talk, and we're going to talk a bit more about issues around process and product a bit later. In a way, we've also talked about writing, not writing as a socio-cultural skill, but we've certainly considered reading as a practice, as a socio-cultural skill. So in the same way, we certainly should think of the role that writing plays within society, and the sorts of ways that it supports and develops people's skills, abilities, you know, more generally. Writing, you know, supporting kind of intellectual development, as well as writing you know, to communicate. We also have notions of writing and creativity. So you know, writing can very much be seen as part of something that you know, it enables people to be more creative in terms of, you know, text, and certainly you know, it's always kind of connected with fiction, certainly very much, but also writing and non-fiction is also a pretty creative process as well. Involves a lot of engagement and idea generation. Another area that we've seen more interest in is ideas of collaborative writing, and certainly if you look at professional writing, you see people certainly engaging in text, not individually, but certainly you know, as a team. So if you produce a piece of text, it's going to be commented on by other people and edited and so on and so forth. We see the notion of writing and texts change. We see ideas around you know, the way that we actually create text is very different from what it was a few years ago, and it's not just about you know, being able to put words together, but also ideas about the way that we are literate in a digital age. And in conjunction with that is our notions of multimodality. So we're not just looking at text that is simple words on paper, it's also other kinds of text as well. So we see, you know, we see pictures included in text, we see links as we've seen in the reading section, and we see other multimedia elements like video and so on and so forth. So the production of text, and what we mean by text, and the way that we produce it, and the sort of literacy that we need to have to actually produce those texts has changed. So text produced for a web page, for example, is rather different from text produced to put into an article or to write a book. And the other thing that's changed dramatically are the the tools that we use for writing, and certainly when I was at school, I never thought more about writing than a pen on paper, and it wasn't much before that people, the notion of a pen was not something that was a biro, it was an ink pen. Certainly that was how my brother had to learn to write when he was at school, whereas now we have a broad range of tools that we use for creating writing, from being able to text message on a mobile phone, right through to complex tools, complex word processing tools that we use on a daily basis. And we increasingly use those tools for communication. So whereas writing wasn't particularly seen as an easy communication tool in the past, so letter writing was slow, and things like other forms of communications, like the telegram, were faster, but very short in what they did. It was intriguing. I was watching a TV program recently, and looking at, they were talking about the number of telegrams in the early, sort of just before the First World War, the number of telegrams that were sort of shifted around the world, and the amount of text that actually created. So I'd not quite sort of seen that, but it's sort of similar in a way to the way that text messages are sent around the world now. So certainly for diplomatic purposes, the telegram was very fundamental to life back in the early part of the 20th century, before the First World War, and probably right up until the early 80s. If we wanted to send something quickly, we send it by telegram, whereas now, of course, there are so many other ways that we can do that. So we see two kind of perspectives. We see an evolving view of the way we understand computer applications as tools for writing. So, and of course they're changing very rapidly again, but certainly for a while we looked at certainly the use of the word processor at the beginning of the 80s and through into the 90s and early 2000s was certainly an area that was very much focused on in this field. But also that idea of the computer as a catalyst for writing activity, as a facilitator of writing, of bringing people together. So we see plenty of examples in the literature of communities being built up, across across continents, between a class in Spain and a class in Canada, for example, enabling us to sort of exchange ideas about culture and this kind of thing. And we see that notion of that Warshauer wrote about, the idea of writing at a computer, using a computer as a tool, and then writing through a computer, so actually to communicate something about ourselves through the tool, using the tools in that kind of way. One area that we see as a fundamental part of writing is that notion of in an education we're modeling ideas, and this sort of notion that's illustrated in this cartoon was certainly very much challenged when people started to start thinking about writing as a process. So writing, as White and Arndt made the point, that when you begin to write as a process, you're not expecting a particular outcome. But if you write with a model in mind, a very product-oriented approach, then you're expecting to produce a certain kind of text. And maybe one of the issues in schools, perhaps still a common problem in schools, is that this sense that writing is to produce this kind of model text, and it isn't anything that's creative. It isn't anything about communication. You produce this text for the teacher. You don't produce this text because you want to write something interesting and meaningful. And so in many classrooms still around the world, this is sort of seen as being something that's a kind of very demotivating process. So that idea of process writing came originally from these guys, Hayes and Flowers, and they certainly made us rethink what we thought about writing in language teaching, whereas we really were very much involved in producing those model texts. We now from the time of 1980, when Hayes and Flowers produced this particular model, we started thinking of writing very differently. And it was Hayes and Flowers were psychologists. They were looking, they actually explored professional writers and what they did, and clearly you can see here that we start off with knowledge. We start off with what is what we know about a topic, our ideas about an audience. If we're writing for a particular audience, we have some idea of the kind of type of writing we might do. We might have particular plans that we have in mind when we think about writing a formal letter, if of course anybody does that kind of thing anymore, or maybe writing an essay for a university or whatever it happens to be. But we certainly start from that point, but once we've begun to think about it, we obviously need to start generating ideas, and that involves some planning, some organization, some kind of goal setting. And if you're you're thinking very much about issues to do with the topic and the audience, trying to sort of structure it so that it's kind of interesting and motivating, and then you take that and you translate that into text. So you take that planning, that organizing, that thinking, that idea of the audience, and you begin to translate that into text, which you kind of monitor and you change and work on. And there's this process of reviewing, reading it through, editing it, and this can be, sometimes it is an individual process, but generally in professional writing, it's an ongoing process with other people. So you get that much more complex idea. So the idea is that you can sit down at a desk and produce something, straight off, in fair copy, as you might have referred to it in the past. Whereas now, of course, with word processing, we don't do it like that anymore. We're constantly revising and changing things, and certainly one of the things I think that's important to think about is the fact that word processors allowed us to do this kind of thing, and this is what I argue for in the final chapter of my edited volume that you have links to. So that notion that the actual tool got us to do different things in different kinds of ways, and made a significant difference, allowed us to do this kind of thing. So even if we worked in a period where we were using a typewriter still had that sense of you're producing the finished product at this point, whereas a word processor, the finished product isn't done until, in a sense, maybe you send it off when you've finished all the editing process, or certainly the initial editing process that you go through. So an area that of course we've been talking about word processors, and word processors back in the 80s were rather different from what they are now. Increasingly, of course, they've moved to being online, and they're mobile. They allow us to do things that we just had no notion of before. And of course, we're not just talking about a word processor anymore. We're talking about comments, postings on Facebook, blogs, etc., etc. But at the same time, this little cartoon makes us sort of think about, well, how when we think about the tools, and we sort of off the cuff say, oh yeah, these a word processor allows us to undo. We've always been able to undo things, but the point is that it's so much easier to actually do that these days. So we have ideas here about word processor as a text processor, and this was what a lot of the early work was done when people first started exploring the affordances of these text processors, this ability to actually produce text. And you see literature on learner attitudes towards use of the word processor. The idea that the word processor eases the composing process, discussions about whether the word processor brings about improved writing per se, so is the writing better as a result of using the word processor, and we see we see writing about what are the actual the optimal factors that give us the best writing benefits. So what are the features of these text processors, these word processors, that allow us to write most effectively? So one of the early summary articles, which is also, it's still a useful set of principles which underpin a lot of later, more recent writing in this idea. And the point about going back is to actually remember that a lot of these ideas are coming in from an earlier time, but they still have some relevance. And Pennington, back in '96, suggests this kind of cause and effect cycle, which you went through a series of processes where you start off, it makes life easier to start with. You move towards writing more, so it's easier to kind of create and produce more text. You're moving to an ability to write in different kinds of ways, and ultimately that ends up in you writing in a better way. So these stages see your attitude changing to writing. So your actual your notions about writing and what you can do begin to change. So you perhaps have sort of these fixed notions of writing, this idea that you're producing these models, but actually when you start beginning to use the word processor, it changes that view of your ideas, and it has that affective effect in the sense of making you feel more positive about writing. The second stage is that you see that process effect in terms of actually the way that learners write becomes kind of different in what they do, and that the product effect, which are the text that you actually see. So you see a different kind of text at the end of the day. So because you feel more positive about the writing, your attitudes change, the way that you write changes, and so the end results are better. So you've got those series of stages going on. So the tool itself makes writing different, and I suppose it's perhaps it's at the stage where probably many of you are at, where perhaps your whole lives are built around word processes. It's probably difficult to see the transition that people went through, but I certainly think that there was a very significant effect that was had there, and perhaps we still haven't quite captured that in many educational contexts where people still have to write for exams. I mean, they're not allowed to use the tools, which of course the tools that everybody is increasingly using both in their personal lives but also in their work lives as well. So this is a study that was done by Diane, and you can read about this study in more detail in her article, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but if you go through looking at the way that this particular student developed over a relatively short period of time. He started off at a pretty low level, his language is in some ways quite accurate in a way here, but it's very basic, and he went through a process. This was a project that we did with a local school, where kids in this school were paired actually with tutors on the same course unit that you're doing, and they wrote back and forward to each other, and over a period of time you'll see that it moves, the actual text that he produces moves quite significantly, to this particular text, which shows quite a lot of change, and this is probably through about a 3 or 4 month period. So Masaryk went from an initial fairly basic writing skill. He gradually developed his ideas and eventually was able to produce quite significant text by the end of the time, and this was a process of using an email system to do this, but at the same time they were actually working in the school, using with their support teachers, sort of using other technologies as well. But it shows the different kinds of text processing possibilities. So we've talked quite a lot about word processors. This is email, and now of course we're moving into a world of different technologies. So within the actual period of time, you see sort of different levels of interactivity between the teachers and the pupils, and this idea that different tools in terms of allow people to kind of conceptualize their ideas quite easily within the text. So this is Kroonenberg talking about his ideas that thoughts and arguments first composed in writing on email give students reflection time prior to engaging in oral work. The quality of the argument is enhanced and thinking is more creative than without this kind of preparation. So you've got things happening both ways. You've got an improvement of their ability to write, but also potentially in using these tools it allows them to actually develop other skills as well. So that safety net, if you like, of producing text, exchanging that text with other people, getting some comments on it, actually helps them sort of think about their spoken language as well. So finally, you've got this idea here of the notion of the change of text. So you've got the kid here talking about my term paper has hypertext, links, full screen video clips, animated fonts, and awesome 3D special effects. Now all I need is a topic. All right, so that idea that we've got got loads of stuff that we can use, but in terms of actually the text itself, where is that at? So we've seen a massive development in different ways that we can produce multimodal writing. Word processors can do it, PowerPoint, desktop publishing, perhaps not so commonly talked about these days, and other tools like Storymakers, for example, and we see these kinds of things replicated increasingly on mobile phones, ways of creating different stories, bringing in pictures, taking pictures on your phone, etc., etc. We come back to hyperlinks, integration of other materials into it, so links to other places. We've got increasingly sophisticated spell checkers. We've got increasingly ways of inputting text through speech as well now. You've got the web as a publishing domain itself, so people increasingly putting material on the web, and learners as well as professional writers. And you've got an increasing move towards mobile writing as well. Devices that allow you to write anywhere, anytime, and you see that increasingly used in schools with iPads and tools like that. So we have, as we've moved into you know, the 21st century, we've seen a plethora of different spaces that you can write in. You know, so you know, the question I suppose is being asked here is, you know, were Shakespeare to have been born today, you know, maybe would he have been quite as prolific, or would he spent his time blogging? Maybe that's not the question that's being asked here, but you know, it's a question that springs to mind. We have so many, you know, distractions in a sense from, and so many you know, places where we can output text. Actually, sometimes it's very difficult to think of where we're going to produce that text. So as we go on through this set of materials, we're going to look you know, at some newer tools, as well as, you know, the more traditional tools. You're going to consider writing on wikis. You know, we communicate in different ways via written text, so you know, what role do these tools play? You know, and you know, we might find out that you know, that we look at tools that actually help us to sort of support our understanding of writing, and you know, are the particular tools that allow us to kind of generate fluency rather than accuracy. So is there an issue there in terms of using a word processor? But you know, these are things to think about as you think about the different tools that we see within this course unit.